Welcome to Wednesday's edition of COVID-19. There has been some progress on the treatment front here in Korea as authorities report over 1,000 cases today as well. There have also been new reports of the latest coronavirus strain in the country as well. Now I have our Kwon-soo standing by with details on this and more. So do start us off with the domestic situation for this Wednesday.
Well, Sunny, Korea is seeing cases above 1,000 for the second straight day. We have a slight uptick from yesterday. Wednesday's caseload stands at 1,050. We do have a decline in domestic transmissions, although those also still above 1,000. Now, soon, Korea is expected to hit the 60,000 milestone in total cases. We also have a double-digit figure of new deaths reported, and the number of patients that are currently in severe or critical condition has also risen to 332. Now, cluster infections, especially those at places of worship and medical facilities, are not slowing down yet. The government is concerned about gatherings with the year-end as well as New Year's Day just around the corner. So they are warning that these already high figures could even climb further if we lose our vigilance in the coming days.
Korea has a relatively low number of cases compared to its population, but around 40% of the country's total infections have occurred in the past month, and the current wave is the biggest crisis we have ever faced.
And we are seeing numbers for the past 2 weeks at above 1,000 or just slightly below 1,000. And if we go over to our map now, around 70% of Wednesday's cases were again reported in the capital region, which includes 387 infections in the capital, Seoul. We also have double digits down in Daegu with 51 cases, and almost the entire nation is being affected with cases every day. And out of the 25 imported cases this Wednesday, 11 were detected at the nation's airport or seaports.
And speaking of imported cases, so I understand authorities, like I mentioned earlier, have reported more cases of the new coronavirus strain.
Right. Authorities confirmed 2 more variant cases on Wednesday, including a man in his 80s who was confirmed with the virus post-mortem after arriving from the UK earlier this month, and a woman in her 20s who also flew in from the UK after making a stop in the UAE, and she tested positive for the virus while being during self-isolation. Now, Korea is among more than a dozen other countries that appear to have had confirmation of the same new strain in the UK or a separate one from South Africa. Now, variants are traveling across the world, including in neighboring Japan and Singapore, Hong Kong, Pakistan, and some of the latest confirmations coming out from Chile, the US, and India as well. And those are the countries with the highest numbers of infections. The US almost at 20 million cases. And also other European countries are dealing with this new strain of the virus, including France and Italy, Spain, Germany, as well as the Netherlands. And now let's move on to some of the daily tallies. Let's start with the UK here, which has set a record high of over 53,000 infections in a day, just a day after its earlier record of over 41,000, and that is attributed to the highly contagious new variant of the virus. Also, Brazil seeing resurgences over 57,000, and the US is actually seeing a decline in daily cases below 200,000 infections, but a record high of hospitalizations. And with that, the number of total cases around the world stands at 82.3 million, and also over 500,000 cases are reported day by day. And those are the updates I have for now. I'll be back with more tomorrow. Sunny?
All right, so thank you. Right, now as mentioned earlier, there has been some advance on the local therapeutic front as one Korean company awaits conditional approval for its antibody therapy. I have our Kim Han-il here in the studio with details on that. Welcome, Han-il.
Good afternoon.
Now, yesterday afternoon, we actually covered the briefing by authorities on Celltrion's application for conditional approval. Hannah, please tell us more.
Sure. So the Korean pharmaceutical giant Celltrion applied for a conditional approval for its COVID-19 antibody treatment yesterday. And a few hours later, the government said it was ready to conduct a full evaluation of the drug's phase 2 clinical trial results. Take a listen.
In regards to antibody treatments, we plan to analyze the results of phase 2 clinical trials and grant conditional approval, while the drug maker simultaneously proceeds with phase 3 trials based on our analysis.
Celltrion recently completed phase 2 trial for its antibody treatment named CTP-59 and is now moving ahead with phase 3. The Ministry of Food and Drug Safety said it plans to approve CTP-59 on the condition that Celltrion submit results of the ongoing phase 3 trial, showing the drug to be safe and effective. The ministry added that it aims to complete the review within 40 days.
Right, within 40 days. And I hear that this is a shorter time frame.
Right, so the Korea's drug regulator is fast-tracking this review process from the usual 180 days to under 40 days. So given this accelerated timeline, the homegrown COVID-19 treatments could be on the market as early as February. The streamlining of the process was a coordinated effort between the Drug Safety Ministry and Celltrion from the beginning. According to Kim Sang-bong, a senior official at the ministry on Tuesday, the regulator managed to reduce the phase 2 trial period to 10 months through close consultation with Celltrion. He said the pair had worked together since the inception of the drug's development to its filing for trial approval in February this year. The ministry has also been supporting Celltrion throughout the trials by giving recommendations on test subjects and other expert advice.
I see. Hannah, could you tell us a bit about the basic science behind this antibody therapy and how it works?
Sure. Celltrion's CTP-59 contains antibodies that neutralize the coronavirus by latching onto the spike proteins on the virus and stimulating the body's immune system to attack and destroy them. A senior official from the Food and Drugs Ministry explained yesterday that it is possible to mass-produce CTP-59 without having to repeatedly collect antibodies from the blood of recovered COVID-19 patients. This can speed up the mass production process, and the distribution of the treatment could happen fairly quickly once the drug receives its final approval.
Meanwhile, Hannah, what would the final approval process look like?
Well, although the country desperately needs more treatment options, the drug regulator wants to ensure the safety and the efficacy of the new antibody treatment. Take a listen.
We will consult members of the Central Pharmaceutical Affairs Review Committee, comprised of non-government experts, to conduct a feasibility study prior to final approval.
The COVID-19 treatment review panel will monitor the effects of the treatment, such as improvements in the patient's symptoms and reducing the time between patients first testing positive and being virus-free, while focusing on safety and quality control. The panel will closely monitor medical institutions to ensure the clinical trials comply with regulations in regards to safety of the participants and reliability of the test results.
So when can we expect to see the results of the phase 3 trial that you mentioned earlier?
Well, Celltrion plans to release the data from its phase 3 clinical trial in early 2021. Their COVID-19 treatment, if approved, would be available to hospitals for clinical purposes only. Celltrion has already started producing CTP-59 at a low rate starting in September and has enough stock for some 100,000 people. The company says it will seek similar emergency use approval from U.S. and European regulators in the coming months.
All right, Hannah, as always, thank you for that coverage and hope to see you again soon.
Thanks for having me.
Also, in related news, the broadcasting industry is working to ensure safety at studios amid the pandemic. And in this next report, we bring you scenes from a music program here at Arirang TV, where personal hygiene and COVID-19 prevention measures have become a priority. Do take a look.
The television and media industries have been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. So how does Arirang TV carry out its antivirus measures?
Hi, it's Shinsebyuk. The K-pop scene has been hit hard by the COVID-19 pandemic as a number of artists and staff members have tested positive for the virus. And this industry in particular is vulnerable to the virus as a lot of people from here and there tend to gather together. So today we're going to look around Arirang TV's Simply K-pop studio and stage to see how quarantine measures are being implemented.
An average of 50 cast members appears on a weekly stage, and if we count other staff members, it amounts to at least 300 people. And that means that the broadcasting scene can become a possible epicenter if just one person turns out to be infected with COVID-19. And that is because one single confirmed case can lead to cluster or secondary infections. And that is why broadcasting stations must thoroughly implement quarantine measures.
So whoever tries to enter the building has to have his or her body temperature and face mask checked. Also, after sanitizing your hands, you are good to go. Now we are going to move to the green rooms and the studio to check out more quarantine processes.
All areas where artists and staff stay are thoroughly disinfected by a cleaning company that offers disinfection services. And because there was a COVID-19 case reported before, it is trying its best to prevent any possible transmission among artists and staff members.
So quarantines completed before the cast arrives, and to prevent a large number of people from gathering in one place, it is using 2 floors as green rooms for the cast. Now let's get inside the studio.
The LED display was used as a tool for stage effect, but with COVID-19, in a bid to stop the spread of the virus, instead of inviting K-pop fans to the studio, they are now allowed to see the show using a video chat. After quarantines completed, performers start arriving. Here also, to make sure there is no large gathering, arrival, rehearsal, and filming schedules all differ for each artist. Only essential workers are allowed during rehearsal and filming to ensure everyone's safety.
I think right now, due to coronavirus, since we're a team of 5, not only us, but we have a lot of staff members that come along with us whenever we do stages and promotions. So because of that, unlike now when we're off stage, we always keep our masks on, be sure to wash our hands and hand sanitize and everything, make sure we stay disinfected to make sure that we're not spreading any potential viruses or anything. I think the most important thing is to be wary of each other, because it's not only us, but also community that we're in right now, so because of that we have to be very careful, especially during these times.
So today we looked around how quarantine measures were implemented at a music studio in Arirang TV. Our daily lives are not the same as the ones that we had a year before, and to get back to our normal daily lives, we must stay alert and strictly follow prevention and quarantine rules. This has been Shinsebyuk.
정부가 제출하는 2021년 예산안은 위기의 시대를 넘어 선도국가로 도약하기 위한 예산입니다. 빠르고 강한 경제 회복을 이루는 데 최우선을 두었습니다.
Social distancing and movement restrictions amid the pandemic have affected trade and travel alike. And observers claim the global economy is on path to its worst recession since World War II. I have Professor Kim Se-won from Ewha Women's University. Pleasure to have you back, Professor Kim.
Good afternoon, Sunny.
And I also have Professor Oh Jun-sok from Sookmyung Women's University. Good to see you again, Professor Oh.
Thank you for having me.
Meanwhile, joining our talk virtually is Mr. Andreas Bauer from the International Monetary Fund. Welcome back, Mr. Bauer.
Great to be with you.
Professor Kim, perhaps we can start with your assessment of the global economic toll of the pandemic.
Yes, global economy is experiencing unprecedented shock from coronavirus pandemic. It is different from previous economic shocks in many different ways. But basically, the pandemic enforces people to stay away from each other. So face-to-face based industries are the most affected, and this is the part of service industry. So that means more developed countries are more suffering from pandemic shock because developed countries' economies are more based on and focused on service industry than that of the developing countries. According to IMF estimation, last year's 2019's global economic growth was 2.8%, but economic growth of this year, 2020, after pandemic will be negative 4.4%. That means there will be over 7% drop in global economic growth, which is a huge one.
I see. Professor Oh, do you believe then that the vaccine campaigns that have been initiated over in the US, the UK, Canada, and other countries are following suit, of course, will aid global economic recovery?
We got a weapon, finally. And then it must be good news for global economy, considering that we got a kind of a game changer. So it will cut down the uncertainty in the upcoming future. COVID-19 is not an issue we can resolve by getting just anxious. The Korean biologic company Celltrion Tuesday this week filed for approval of the COVID-19 antibody treatment for use. We got another weapon. And then one of the professors in my university, a pathologist, said that vaccines, not treatment, would be the ultimate kind of key to ending this kind of pandemic war. As COVID-19 has prolonged for longer than we expected, the global value chain, supply chain, and then even business network, and then economic cycle come almost to a halt due to shutdown of business, as Germany did yesterday. So in the middle of this struggling of this kind of hanging in, that global vaccination could be a trailblazer of the global economy. And one more thing we have to think about is the Korean economy is highly dependent upon the trade-oriented and then outbound characteristics. So introducing this kind of vaccine could be understood as a signal for reviving the world economy. And then let's take an example. As for benchmark measurement, World Trade Uncertainty Index by EIU, they tell that introducing vaccination might be understood as a good signal for restoring global market demand and supply. It says that normalizing investment in the private sector will ignite the engine of the Korean economy again.
I see. Well, that is good to know. Meanwhile, Mr. Bauer, what has been the impact of a country's COVID-19 containment strategy on its economic growth, generally speaking?
Yeah, well, I mean, social distancing and lockdowns were, of course, a necessary response to contain the spread of the virus, especially in the early part of the pandemic. And as much as it was necessary, of course, it did have a negative impact on economic activity, especially in the services sector, as my colleague just said. Now, we looked at the experience of Asian countries with their measures in the last few months, and we took 3 lessons out of that. The first lesson was the importance of timing, especially kind of imposing these kinds of restrictions early on when the virus propagation is still at a relatively low level. That really helped countries that acted early to flatten the curve, the virus curve effectively, and that reduced the impact, the negative impact on the economy. The downturn was shorter and less deep. Exit, the second point that was important. Countries that really brought down the virus propagation to very low levels before starting to dismantle these restrictions did generally better. They had better health outcomes and less severe economic impact. And then the third factor also were testing, tracing, and isolation. Those countries that were strong on that front, they were able to impose less severe restrictions, less severe quarantine, and that again was positive for their growth.
Right, Mr. Bauer, your agency has forecast that Korea's GDP will move up 2 notches to rank 10th in the world this year, as its earlier containment efforts have kept the virus under relative control thus far. Please tell us more about your prospects for the Korean economy.
Certainly. Well, I mean, 2020 certainly was a difficult year for the Korean economy, as for all other economies. But thanks to the effective health response, and also the supportive measures that the government has taken for the economy, Korea's economy really fared much better than many others, and in fact, it will have the smallest contraction among all the OECD's countries. In our latest forecast that we issued in October, we were expecting the economy to contract by about 1.9% this year. But since then, really, the recovery has surprised us a bit on the upside, especially in the export sector. So I think for the full year, we will probably have a contraction that is a bit smaller than what we forecast, and that is certainly good news. And also for 2021, for the next year, we're expecting a fairly robust recovery with growth around 3%. Of course, that assumes that the current increase in the virus count will be kept under control, and also that we will see a gradual rollout of vaccines, which are very important for the economic outlook, as was just mentioned as well.
Right. Professor Kim, I'd like to direct your attention to Korea's exports now, something that Mr. Bao has just mentioned. I understand Korea, compared to its global counterparts, has been witnessing relative stability with regard to its shipments overseas, despite the heavy blows suffered by its counterparts worldwide. What is behind this phenomenon, do you suppose?
In the middle of a difficult situation of coronavirus pandemic, one thing fortunate was there was a global trading decrease in early stage of pandemic, but that quickly recovered. So I think one of the largest beneficiaries of this quick recovery of global trading is Korea, because Korea is one of the largest foreign-dependent country in the world. In August, actually, there was huge increase of Chinese export over 9% in monthly basis. And after that, from September, Korean export began to picking up from about a 5% increase to 6% increase in a month. So that became a big momentum for Korean economic recovery. If you take a look at export items of the Korean economy, the largest export item and second largest export item, memory chips and automobile, became main factor of the growth of the Korean export. Both of the two major export items grew in 2 digits in a single month. And in November, actually, Korean export increased over 4% compared to same months in the previous year. But I think there still is some uncertainties in the future of Korean export, because still coronavirus pandemic is spreading out all over the world, and there is still uncertainties on Korean exchange rate, which is stronger Korean won or weakening US dollars.
I see. Does the government have any contingency measures, that is, to deal with these concerns that you've mentioned?
Well, if you take a look at particularly exchange rate situation, there are lots of factors that intensify the value of Korean won. Korean economy is maintaining huge trade surplus, and foreign investors are purchasing lots of Korean stocks these days. These are all strong factors of the Korean won or weakening US dollars these days. Right. So maybe Korean government wants to intervene in the market to stabilize or weaken the value of the Korean won, but it is not actually allowed, because US government, US Department of Treasury is watching out the behaviors of a Korean governments for controlling or manipulating Korean won's value in the international money market.
I see. Professor, finance officials here in the country have pledged to keep their fiscal taps open in the coming year as well. Is Korea capable of handling such fiscal spending?
I'm afraid not. It might be a long story when I touch on the seniority effect of international settlement of economics. But Euro, US dollar, and even Japanese yen, they have a seniority effect, while the Korean won is just a local currency. Korean won has not. So it is a great mistake to assume that Korean won local currency can be compared with the key currency such as Euro and US dollar by the same standard. As Professor Kim commented about the Korean characteristics, as the Korean economy of characteristics, foreign-oriented, but we have to think about the fact that Korean economy is a trade-oriented and relatively smaller economy than other OECD member countries, which means financially very vulnerable to kind of economic shock and other types of financial attack. It is reasonable and quite to the point, the need of expansionary fiscal policy in time of underperforming market. It seems like a massive blood transfusion for the patient. At this economic situation, there is a high possibility of austerity trap, which means that government debt control, which at the time of the severe economic weaknesses, it might be counterproductive. It generates a complicated kind of bad chance for the economic recovery. So at this economic situation, there is no other choice but to make an expansionary fiscal policy. But what is worried about at this moment is not the volume or the capacity, whether or not to bear the government debt increase. What matters at this time is the velocity of government debt increase. So we have to control the velocity of the debt increase. Think about a situation, there is a severely wounded patient bleeding too much, but massive blood transfusion into a global economy could be effective only if a blood vessel holds on the pressure of the injection. If not, vessel break, which might imply a starting point of a stroke of an economy. It ended up in a financial disaster.
I see. Very interesting imagery right there, Professor Oh. Meanwhile, Mr. Bauer, I believe the IMF is also urging against the premature withdrawal of fiscal support for the economy, even as countries are piling on record amounts of debt amid COVID-19. Please do explain to us this stance on fiscal spending by the IMF.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can offer a medical analogy here, but maybe more simply, the COVID shock is a temporary shock to the economy. So suddenly firms have been seeing their revenues plummet. Workers have lost their jobs by no real fault on their own. But at the same time, also we know that when the pandemic is over, many of these firms that are now in trouble, they'll be able to restart. They'll be able to live, to operate, and many of the workers will be able to find employment. So it's good policy really to hand them a hand and help them tide over this crisis. This will help also reduce, the impact on the economy, the downturn. So this is why we are recommending to countries to expand the deficit in the current conjuncture during the crisis. Of course, especially the countries that have been responsible, that have managed their finances well, that have low debt levels, will have a greater capacity to do that. Korea is one of the countries in that category, fortunately. But then after that, of course, we will have to have a period of consolidation, but that should really come once we have been able to overcome this pandemic, and it can be done gradually.
I see. So, Mr. Bao, in your opinion, you do believe Korea is capable of such an aggressive fiscal spending policy then?
Absolutely. We do think that Korea has fiscal space and the capacity, and it should use kind of the space it created in the good times in a shock like this.
I see. Professor Kim, let's turn to the global stock market that you mentioned earlier. Amid the raging pandemic, how has the stock market been faring thus far?
Well, global stock market is booming, even though the real sector of the economy is suffering from serious downturns of the economy. So the gap between stock market and real part of the economy gets larger under coronavirus pandemic. So this is something that we didn't experience before, because usually people sell the stock when economy is bad previously. If we check out the major markets return from the lowest point of this year in March to December, US Dow Jones return from March is about 35%, and Chinese Shanghai index return is about 25% from March to December. And German markets return is also over 30% from March to December. And finally, Korean Kospi's return from March to December is amazing, 90%. Of course, the boom of the stock market is fueled and accelerated by ample liquidity and low interest rate from central bank. But theoretically, I have to say that the high price of the stock today is something reflection of future recovery of the economy. So if global economy and Korean economy does not recover in the first half of next year, there could be something problems of bubbles in the stock market, which could be another burden of the global economy and Korean economy.
I see. And speaking about that, Mr. Bao, what is the IMF's forecast for the global economy for the year 2021?
Yeah, so fortunately, the global economy, activity in the global economy has strengthened after a big collapse in the first half of this year. We now see economies on practically all continents recovering, but that recovery is uneven and is also incomplete still. And of course, we also have seen lately some signs that the momentum of the recovery is slowing because of the resurgence of the virus in many parts of the world. Now, next year, certainly the outlook is much better. After the big contraction we had this year, and it was mentioned at the beginning, for next year we forecast a expansion in the global output of 5.2% increase in real GDP. That's a quite strong expansion. But still, even after that, most of the advanced and also emerging market economies will still be at a level of GDP that is somewhat below the level they had before the crisis outbreak. So the recovery will still be a work in progress in 2021 and the following years.
Mr. Bao, just out of curiosity, is the IMF's positive projection for next year based on the presence of widespread vaccination?
Well, it has an assumption that, especially in advanced economies, the vaccination will make a lot of progress next year. But in some parts of the world, of course, this might fall into 2022.
Right. Professor.
But you're right to say, if I may just say, there is a lot of uncertainty around this, and that the pace of vaccination certainly will be one of the main factors. If we see a very quick vaccination, we could see some upside to the growth forecast, but we could also see downside. So again, we're still in an environment of lots of uncertainty.
Right, it is quite uncertain. Professor, what are the variables, speaking about uncertainty, of course, that look to affect economic recovery for major nations next year?
First of all, I fully understand and I fully agree with Professor Kim. We have to pay attention to the big concern. The gap between the financial market and real market becomes wider and wider. So it might be one of factors we have to pay much attention. The other thing is not over until it's over, and it won't over when Korea is over. It is only over when all countries around the world are over with the pandemic. We commonly say that China is the factory of the world, and then USA, and then EU called the market of the world. Thinking about this, it is needless to say that with the success of vaccination, back to normalizing global factory and then global market operation could be crucial for the global economic recovery, which triggers investment, employment, and consumption in the private sector. But let's take a moment. What if it is not over when everybody thinks it's over? It could be a variable. We have to pay attention to that. Though it is needed to take a double check, most countries chose the safety and sustainability in the future at the sacrifice of economy at present. But a few countries, they did not. They could raise it kind of uncertainty, and then we have to pay attention to that. COVID-19 is an uncertainty factor, clogging investment and then employment and then consumption in the market. What will happen? Expansionary policy pump massive liquidity and inject high pressure to the clogged vein in an economy. In that sense, financial market stability matters, a key variable of economy in terms of durability and then durability of financial stress around the world in 2021. So we have to pay more attention to the change of the gap between financial market and real market.
Right. Professor Kim, Professor Oh just mentioned the domestic consumption and the job market, which have been hard hit here in Korea as well. What would you propose as measures to perhaps spur local spending and employment opportunities here in the country?
I think the best policy for promoting domestic consumption would be the government's COVID relief funds over and over again as the resources and time allows. Actually, Korean government decided to roll out a third COVID relief funds yesterday from early January of next year, which is actually next week. The size is about the 9.3 trillion won, or about $9 billion US dollars. As the situation of self-employers and small business owners are worsening quickly, I think Korean government's decision to roll out another third COVID relief fund is a timely decision to help out these people. Compared to previous two times of COVID relief funds, the third relief funds is more focused on supporting the COVID hard-hit people like small business owners and self-employers. And particularly, government provides the loans to these people up to 10,000 US dollars or 10 million Korean wons at the interest rate of less than 2%. And this is going to be a great help to these people. So also government provides tax deductions to landlords who cut the rents to business owners, small business owners and self-employers. So this package of relieving economic burden of small business owners will be a great help.
And just out of curiosity, Professor Oh, what are your thoughts about the third emergency relief package that the government has unveiled?
Yeah, there is no other choice at this moment. We have to save time, and then as for earning time, that those kind, as Professor Kim mentioned about the universal basic income or kind of subsidy for the small and medium enterprise, it is, I might say, it is prerequisite to get over this kind of financial disaster and then the lockdown of the business operations.
Right. Mr. Bauer, what would you prioritize with regard to Korea's economic policies for the new year?
Yeah, well, let me start with two things we already have touched on. First, of course, vaccination. Clearly, securing enough supplies and rolling out an efficient distribution of an effective vaccine, I think, will be the key game in town, if you want to say it in a way, in Korea and elsewhere. So really, this widespread vaccination will help the economy to get back on its feet fully. So I think that is a clear priority for the government. The second point I would mention is maintaining the policy support. We've talked quite a bit about fiscal policy already, but I would add also monetary policy and financial sector support as well, so ensuring that there's enough credit, because the vaccine rollout will take time. And until then, I think support is needed. The third factor I would add here as a priority maybe is to use the recovery to develop new growth drivers, growth in the medium and long term. So for the next phase of Korea's development, I think there's been a very interesting start with the Korean New Deal, and that focuses on developing the green and the digital economy as growth drivers. We think that there can be additional measures, broader measures, deregulation, especially in the services sector, to allow new firms to come in, to promote innovation, greater flexibility in the labor market. All these kind of broader reforms, I think, can complement what the Korean New Deal already is starting and try to really bring out these new growth drivers for Korea.
Right. Professor Oh, how can Korea meanwhile work to turn this crisis into a chance for further growth?
It is a long way to go. I could remember a line by a poet, I have a promise to keep, and then I have a miles to go before I sleep. Though it is true COVID-19 pandemic is a disaster, it could be a good chance for Korea. Structural reformation in an economy into accelerating and then deepening digital transformation. We've experienced from the COVID-19 and then change the lifestyle and business style and then pattern of our daily behavior. So it might turn this kind of a disaster into an opportunity. Two things we have to remember in the short term. The urgency should be backed by the government policy. But in the long term, efficiency can never be crowded out by the urgency, restoring market mechanism, upgrading efficiency and competitiveness with the help of digital transformation in the private sector. We got a lesson from the COVID-19, I suppose.
Right. Professor Kim, what are your thoughts about turning this current crisis of the pandemic here into an opportunity for the country?
Actually, I'm very glad that Mr. Bao and Professor Oh raised the issue of long-term economic structural changes over pandemic shocks. One thing that we did not pay much attention is the pandemic shock comes with structural changes of the economy, from traditional manufacturing to more environment-friendly industry or IT industries. So as we talked about, Korean export increase is much related to these global structural changes like memory chips, medical devices, and displays. So that means that we need to supporting reconstruction of Korean economy from current status to more environment-friendly industries. In this respect, President Moon's Korean New Deal policy includes that promotion policies for environment-friendly industries and IT industries. So we have to more aggressively implement these policies for preparing better economic growth after the end of pandemic shock.
Right. Now, Mr. Bao, this is an impromptu question, but for countries that have not been as lucky as other countries that have been able to secure vaccines, what can be done by the global community to better assist countries that will have suffered tremendously in the midst of this pandemic?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I think the IMF is a multilateral institution. We think there's a greater common good, and we try to bring countries together. So one of the issues that I think our managing director has raised for quite some time, together with other colleagues, is the importance of global solidarity as well. And there are certain mechanisms available, like COVAX, that is trying to distribute vaccines globally. There are also some countries that have secured already a supply that is actually larger as their own needs, and that have pledged to share some of these supplies. So I think global cooperation will really be important to help countries, especially developing countries, both with the supply, but also with the logistics and the distribution. So countries will also need to help in kind of setting up the vaccine distribution. And hopefully we can make this a great moment of global cooperation.
All right, Mr. Bao over there, away from us here in the studio. Thank you very much for making the time to join us live at this hour with your thoughts. Professor Kim, as always, thank you for your insights. And Professor Oh, thank you for your medical metaphors to better understanding the economic toll of the pandemic.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Right, well, the best COVID-19 prevention option at our disposal as of now is limiting our venture outdoors for social purposes. So do take care. See you tomorrow. Thank you for watching.